Often as a result of Indigenous knowledge being dismissed, First Nations communities in Northern Ontario are disproportionately impacted by forest fires. And so here are some recent media examples of the impacts of forest fires. As I mentioned, there's been regular displacement of First Nations communities in Northern Ontario. We've seen air quality impacts across Northern Ontario, affecting other provinces as well. I think probably the Fort McMurray fire stands out particularly in all of our memories. And Canada is not the only country impacted by increases in forest fires. Let's see if this is the first test of my PowerPoint making skills and sharing them on Zoom. If you can see this video, this is a forest fire outside the city of Samchuk in Kawanjo in South Korea last month. This fire destroyed at least 159 homes and 46 other buildings. About over 6,000 people were evacuated as a result. Some of you might recall some fires that were out of control in the Pantanal, the world's largest tropical wetland, last year. And there's some growing concerns that the wetland area might not recover from that fire. Oh, let's see, now I've got to figure out how to advance my slide. So with that, I'll give you a little bit of an agenda for my 20 minutes of time here. For those of you who've called in, saw Dr. Groot on the advertisement and we're hoping for the Dr. Groot with those glasses in this photo to speak, who is actually an expert on forestry. I am sorry to disappoint you. I'm his daughter. I'm not an expert in forests or forest fires, but I'm a public health physician with a particular interest in the health impacts of forest fire smoke. So this is a picture of me and my dad from about 25 years ago. And he is a climatologist, and probably to his disappointment, I'm a public health physician. So my agenda, I'll talk a little bit about the forest fire trends in Canada, recognizing that I'm not an expert. So this is sort of my non-expert overview of forest fire trends. And then I'll talk a little bit more in my wheelhouse about the health impacts of forest fires, focusing particularly on smoke. So thinking about, there's lots of health impacts of forest fires, but recognizing the air theme, I'll speak specifically about the impacts, and then briefly some ways in which we can mitigate some of those impacts in the short term, recognizing that ultimately fire mitigation will be helpful, but that's again a little bit outside my wheelhouse. So a little bit of background. Forest fires can be categorized in lots of different ways, but one helpful categorization is dividing them into surface fires and crown fires. So as you might suspect, surface fires burn the material near the ground, so things like pine needles or leaves or low shrubs. And surface fires can climb up fire ladders, so dead branches or dried out vegetation, and become crown fires. Crown fires move through the canopy of the forest stand, burning sort of from one tree top to the next. And they have much longer flame lengths, and they can start spot fires far ahead of the fire front, so they can sort of throw embers. The surface fires can also throw embers, but typically not as far as the crown fires. So that means that crown fires are often more destructive and can move fast. Although there are types of surface fires that can move pretty quickly, like grass or marsh fires. Humans actually started about half of forest fires in Canada, but lightning caused fires account for 80 to 90% of the area burned. And that's because, as you can imagine, if we've got lightning strikes in a remote area, they're harder to detect, they're harder to put out, and sometimes they're not necessary, you don't have to put them out, right? They're not close to any human settled areas. And you can imagine, how difficult it would be in an area away from human settlement to detect one of these lightning strikes. So forest fires are quite complex, but my physician brain will break them down into 3 pieces. And I'll reference United Nations Environment Program diagram here. The fire behavior is determined by 3 major factors: the fuel, the weather, and the topography. So, the fuel in terms of the vegetation type, the amount, how dry it is. And, in some parts of Northern Ontario, there's been moves to try to encourage planting of, fire resistant plants near settled areas. So for example, high moisture content or difficult to burn brush like ninebark or milkweed. Topography, fires burn faster going up hills. As the heat rises, it dries out the forest in front of the fire, and that creates more intense fire behavior. And then of course weather. Winter, not a great time for forest fires. Lots of rain, as long as it's not stormy, right? Because those lightning strikes are important. And then, the downstream impacts of that. There's economic, environmental, and societal impacts, although they sort of all intersect, right? You can imagine that, damage to infrastructure or assets might lead to population displacement or homelessness, which ultimately impacts health. Or if you have erosion as a result of loss of plant material, that impacts your water quality, which can ultimately impact health as well. So we'll focus down here on this very far end of the diagram, but recognizing that all of these factors are interact with one another. So a little bit of a background in terms of the trends of forest fires in Canada, with a caveat, a big caveat. There have been really significant changes to land use and vegetation composition in some areas of Canada. We also are better at detecting fires. We're also better at suppressing fires. So that makes temporal comparisons hard to interpret. Are we finding more fires because we're better at it? Or is less area being burned because we're suppressing fires, more successful in suppressing fires? But sort of the overall trend since 1959 that both area burn and the number of large fires, so fires over 200 hectares, have increased significantly, but human-caused fires are decreasing. And as you probably know, growing forests absorb a lot of carbon dioxide, but forest fires emit a lot of carbon dioxide. And so for the last few decades, Canadian forests have been net sources of carbon dioxide, not sinks. And that's in part due to fires, but also due to insects, disease, and logging. Overall, in Canada, the fire season is starting about a week earlier and ending 1 week later. And so, sort of the general trend is increase. But there's a huge amount of regional variation. So this is the overall trend in Canada, but that's very different, looking from west to east. Western Canada sees the significant impact, whereas the increase is not really impacting Eastern Canada. And even within those sort of geographical areas, there's a lot of variation. And what might the future hold? The latest IPCC report predicts an increase in extreme fire weather, but there's lots of processes, as we looked at in the previous slide, that impact wildfire risk. And it makes it a little bit hard to both look at the previous trends and say, what is the underlying cause? Is it climate change? Is it something else? Is it, lots of different things interacting? And those same complexities make it difficult to predict the impacts of climate change on future fire seasons. But again, the sort of general trend is, you've got warmer weather, so you've got longer fire seasons, your snow melts earlier. And so you're more at risk throughout the longer season. Your warmer temperatures also, can increase thunderstorm activity, so you're generating more lightning. And if you recall that the majority of large area burns are related to lightning strikes. And then your warmer temperatures and those longer summers can also dry out fuel. And then there's also, some other climate change impacts that could add fuel load. So for example, if there's ice storms or high winds or insect damage that can damage or create dead wood, that could also increase fire risk. But there are some parts of Canada that are likely to see increased rain and ultimately fewer fires. So if you have increased rain throughout a fire season without the increased lightning risk, some areas of Canada will probably see fewer fires. And again, the impacts will primarily be seen in the impacts of increased fires will primarily be seen in Western Canada and Northern Ontario. At least that's my layperson's interpretation of the complex forestry literature. I think one thing to keep in mind, though, is that despite their human health impacts, not all fires are harmful and not all fires need to be extinguished. Fires serve an important ecological purpose. I copied this painting, Tom Thompson's The Jack Pine. Jack pine cones only open and spread seed after a fire. So without fires and their ecological purpose here, we wouldn't be able to propagate jack pine. In the Great Lakes region where I grew up, jack pine like these and also red pine are the most flammable tree species, and they can carry burning embers even kilometers ahead of the fire front. So what else other than burning pine embers, can be carried by wildfire smoke? My non-chemist background, I think of basically the smoke, and Jane, you can correct me in your talk next. Basically, smoke to me is the weird stuff that's produced during incomplete combustion. So when I think about my basic understanding from high school, you've got complete combustion, you've got enough oxygen, all you're going to get is water and carbon dioxide. But when you've got incomplete combustion, you start to get some strange things. And so that's what you get. We see lots of incomplete combustion in forest fires. And the forest fire smoke is then made up of a pretty complex mixture. So you've got some polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons like naphthalene. You've got carbon monoxide. You've got benzene. The formation of aldehydes like formaldehyde and acrolein, levoglucosan, which is sort of seen as the marker of fires. It's quite reliably produced during forest fires. And of course, fine particulate matter, in some cases composed of these other things sticking to one another. And so I'll focus on the health impacts of exposure to these things, the constituents of smoke, but with a focus on the fine particulate matter. Of course, there's other health effects other than just of forest fires, other than exposure to smoke. Obviously significant mental health impacts, injuries, water contamination, but focusing on those impacts of smoke. The health effects of the particulate matter from wildfire smoke are probably the best understood. But in the short term, some of those other components probably have similar effects or, grouped together to make fine particulate matter. So as a reminder, fine particulate matter is any particulate matter less than 2.5 microns in diameter. And that size is significant because it can be inhaled further into the respiratory system than larger particles. And inhaling these particles irritates the respiratory system and results in inflammations. You've got eye irritation, runny nose, sore throat, phlegm and cough, wheezing, headache, shortness of breath. Anyone who's accidentally left something in the oven too long knows about the impacts of smoke. And so this is just extended in forest fire season for people who are exposed to forest fire smoke. Most significantly, these impacts are experienced by people with pre-existing lung conditions like asthma or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, because that respiratory irritation and inflammation can exacerbate their illnesses. And maybe there's an immunologist on the call who can explain this to me, but the inflammation and irritation can also make it harder to fight respiratory infections. So in forest fire season, in addition to sort of the irritation, like chemical bronchitis, emergency departments tend to see increases in infectious pneumonia and infectious bronchitis as well. And that shortness of breath can also exacerbate pre-existing heart disease. So sometimes in severe smoke events, we see increases in presentation to hospital of myocardial infarctions or heart failure. And then in addition to people with those pre-existing conditions, we also see, people who breathing faster, young kids, pregnant women, more impacted. And then older adults who might have a little less reserve. And so then in terms of mitigating these impacts in the short term, sort of from a health systems perspective, this is a photo from just above my house here in Sudbury. You can see my attempts to create blackout curtains for my son. But this is a view that's obscured by forest fire smoke from northwestern Ontario, Manitoba. So I'm in Sudbury, so I'm, thousands of kilometers away. And so, some things individuals can do during forest fire season. If there's a forest fire and they're exposed to smoke in their community, they can stay inside and cancel outdoor events, keep the windows up when driving. Augmenting indoor air filtration can be helpful. And I hope that the focus on air filtration as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic will help reduce exposure to air pollutants. And maybe as a public health physician, my particular interest is a focus on institutions. I think it's really difficult for us to counsel individuals living in private dwellings to improve their air filtration. When if people are renters or have other places where they need to spend their funds, it's not on air filtration. This is a really big ask. So alternatively, communities can implement clean air shelters. So places like libraries or community centers that implement good air filtration, where people can go spend some time, now that we're used to remote work, or some leisure time in these facilities where their burden of exposure to smoke is reduced. For people who do have asthma or COPD action plans, to implement those, or for people who don't have them, to work with their primary care provider to put them in place. In rare cases, evacuation is sometimes recommended for severe smoke hazard. Of course, when there's risk of physical injury or exposure to flame or heat source, evacuation is recommended. But for smoke in particular, considerations might be if the smoke hazard is severe and expected to last for more than a week, or it's contaminated with a particular substance, like it's not just a forest fire that, like something else, another facility, for example, has been burned, or there's a particularly susceptible subgroup that can be evacuated. But on the flip side, there's health effects of the evacuation as well. From a mental wellness perspective, evacuations are really challenging for communities. If communities are moved to a shelter facility that doesn't have adequate infection control, often you can see infections spread quickly in sheltered facilities. And certainly, ensuring that people are able to access their regular care or prescription medications in evacuations can be really challenging too. So making sure that people are well from the non-smoke exposure perspective can be challenging in those situations. So that is my very quick overview of forest fires and the smoke and their health impacts. And so I'll just leave you very briefly with a 1-minute video. Oh no, I won't. First, I will tell you about the chronic health effects. Just to say, we don't know much about the long-lasting impacts of exposure to wildfire smoke. It's something that's pretty difficult to measure both at an individual level and a population level. But there's possible links to things like the development of coronary artery disease, hypertension, and possibly lung and other cancers. You might have recognized some of those components of smoke that I presented earlier are known or suspected carcinogens like benzene or acrolein. And in wildfire fighters, we do see increases in the risk of these diseases, and they're individuals who are most heavily exposed. So now I will end on a very short video just from the Ministry of Natural Resources, because they're the group who works to keep us safe here in Northern Ontario during forest fire season. And I think I'd like any excuse to look at a water bomber. So I'll end with that. So thanks very much. Can you hear the sound? Jane, could you give me a thumbs up? Okay, perfect.
Well, I remember my first fire as a bird dog pilot, looking down and actually watching the water bombers and thinking that I wanted to do that. That's where it started, for sure. It's a very competitive industry, and I don't think it matters woman or man, it's still competitive, and you got to be good at what you do. And luckily I've been passionate and good about what I do. This past summer in Geraldton, I looked around the ramp and saw the plane I flew for detection, the plane I flew for bird dog, the twin otter, and the 415 all on the same ramp. So I was pretty proud, yeah. It was a very proud moment. It was sort of surreal to see it all go, oh, wait, I did this.